Good morning, everybody. I'm left-handed, so this should be easy for me. What I want to talk to you about this morning is, I think, going to segue nicely along from what Rob has been talking about. It was with a sense of dread that I realised I was following the always impressive Rob, so likewise I'll do my best to keep you entertained. What I'm going to talk to you about is a similar theme to the whole people and adaptation thing that Rob was focusing on, but with special reference to wildlife. In your programme, it's called biodiversity. I prefer to avoid the term biodiversity. I'm just going to call it wildlife. It rolls off the tongue much more easily. And when I say wildlife, just bear in mind what I mean for the purposes of this talk is habitats, species, but also geology and geomorphology. So let's crack on. Just to give you a flavour, I see from the programme that you've all been variously on trips around the East Anglian coast yesterday. I'm sure that was very, very nice. Just to give you a flavour of just within the Suffolk Coast and Heath Sail in Bede, some of which is not too far from just outside this building. Just a sense of the richness and the diversity of some of the wildlife that can be found just very close to here. Got a full range of things on it's quite a mobile, soft, dynamic coast. Intertidal mudflats, salt marshes, freshwater habitats, including reed beds and wet grassland, and that's going to be quite a common theme as we talk through this. Also a vast range of species, some of which are actually quite rare and threatened. So there is quite a challenge. This diversity isn't obviously exclusive to the coastal zone, but as a coastal practitioner, I might argue that some of the issues around that diversity are perhaps a little more acute and a little more immediate. Similar to the terrestrial zone, there are certain processes at work which govern the way that habitats and species respond to climate, but also the way they respond to the way we as human beings impact on them. I would argue again at the coastal zone that those issues are perhaps a little bit more immediate and the rules of the game are slightly different. To use a football analogy, I think the goal posts are slightly wider and the footballs are coming at you with perhaps greater frequency and greater speed. And it does mean that we're in the business of not just reacting but trying to preempt some of the change that will allow the wildlife on the coastal zone to adapt. Just to give you 4 examples here, clockwise, we've got mass movement and slumping of cliffs, which I think is in Dorset, which just serves as a reminder really that the way that the coast is reacting to water is not just from the sea, it's from the land as well. And I think some of you might have visited North Norfolk yesterday, you may have seen soft cliffs which are responding to those very processes, water impacting and shaping the coast from both directions. We've got eroding salt marsh, which is a bit of a feature and a challenge down here in Suffolk and Essex right now. We've got an estuary, this is the Old Ore, issues there to do with change and adaptation and making room for habitats. And then finally, the North Norfolk coast of Clyde, world famous iconic nature reserve, unfortunately in this picture taken in 2007 completely underwater. So we'll just focus on Clyde for a bit. Clyde salthouse marshes on the North Norfolk coast. I'll just put a disclaimer in at the start of this. If there are any Environment Agency colleagues in the room, everything I'm about to say, none of this is aimed at you personally. They know me well enough. The traditional approach to managing flood management at Clyde for years has been to use what is actually a natural feature and actually quite an important habitat and geomorphological feature in its own right. This shingle ridge, which you can see from this picture, which is about 10 years old, for years was mechanically bulldozed up into quite a vertical, severe profile. And this was to try and hold the line and maintain this as a coastal defence. Reason being that behind it there are a lot of socio-economic assets, not least the village in the background, which is Salthouse. but also a whole swathe of different wildlife habitats, particularly in this case salt marshes, saline lagoons, wet grassland and reed beds, all supporting a massive assemblage of breeding and wintering birds. So very important. But what we found over time was that ultimately this was unsustainable. And this is that same shingle ridge taken during a storm event in 2007, when what we can see manifested is that after several years of this bulldozing technique, there was virtually no shingle left in that shingle ridge. So what we end up with is a double whammy of damaged habitat but no effective flood protection either. So clearly a new approach required, a much more sustainable one. I should just add that the near suicidal person here isn't me, and for health and safety purposes I didn't take the picture either, but I think it serves the purpose very well. So a new approach needed, and I've moved further around the East Anglian coast to Suffolk now. This is Easton Broad, not far from Southwold, a little bit north of here. Similar principles to what we're seeing at Clyde, but by way of a different example, same habitat, different location. What we've got here is also a shingle ridge, but which is no longer bulldozed and has been allowed to assume a much more natural profile. So a much flatter, natural feature now, much more what it would be like under natural conditions. And a saline lagoon, itself an important habitat. And a brackish stroke freshwater reed bed. Quite a nice little assemblage of important things here, all with their different requirements and different management needs. What we've also got though is quite a rare bird, and the bittern's probably going to come up again and again, not because it's the most important thing, but it's just quite a good way of using it as an example. The bittern doesn't like it salty. Eventually this site is going to become more salty. What do we do with the bittern? The bitterns have to go somewhere else. That's it in a nutshell. But what it does mean is that our thinking, and this applies to you as AONB managers and practitioners as much as it does as to nature reserves managers, we need to start thinking outside of boundaries. Boundaries, site boundaries, the designation boundaries that we place on our maps, they mean very little to the way that the coastal processes are working and the way that the wildlife responds to those. So we need to start thinking slightly more broadly. We do have legal requirements to maintain some of these things as well. So what it means is those freshwater habitats which we've currently got on the coast, Norfolk, Suffolk, elsewhere, ultimately, and this depends on how things like sea level rise are played out, they're not going to work, they're not going to be sustainable. So new freshwater habitats need creating elsewhere, and these don't necessarily have to be at the coast. And what this means for you as AONB managers, protected landscape managers, is that those protected landscapes are not going to stay the same. And we need to start building that into our thinking. This is Hillgate in the Fens. This is a joint EA Norfolk Wildlife Trust project with Natural England support. This is a new wetland which ultimately is being driven by the need to offset the predicted loss of breeding bittern at the North Norfolk coast. The coastal habitats themselves also provide quite an important ecosystem function. The salt marshes are really important in their own right, but there is no better effective defence for a seawall than a healthy salt marsh in front of it. I've got an example here from Essex. I've slightly cheated because the area to the left isn't actually the open sea or the estuary. This is a managed realignment, but it serves the purpose well. On the right hand side, healthy salt marsh, healthy seawall costs much less to maintain. On the left hand side, open water, not much salt marsh, and a seawall that costs a lot more to maintain. So there's a synergy here between the needs of wildlife and the economic drivers for why the coast has to be protected and how we do it. Similarly, we can use the sediment in our estuaries, and there is an awful lot of it, particularly in East Anglia, as a way of maintaining habitats, not necessarily for the long term, but as part of a suite of adaptive tools. There are two examples here. One is on the Solent in Hampshire on Leamington Harbour. And the second one is on the right, is on the Deepen estuary here in Suffolk, where dredged sediments from the ports of Harwich and Felixstowe is being used to try and restore degraded salt marsh, simply by pumping the sediment back onto it. It also serves the purpose of keeping that sediment in the system. It's not lost to the estuary as a whole, and there's a lot of benefit in doing that because it tries to maintain as natural a function as possible. We're quite strong supporters of this approach as part of a general suite of tools for actually trying to maintain coastal habitats both in their own right but also as a flood defence service. Similarly, and on occasion, and this is one of the most emotive issues which, like myself and others like Rob and other coastal managers, find ourselves engaged in discussions about managed realignment. This is effectively where, faced with potential squeeze of coastal habitats between rising tides and seawalls, there is a need to try and create space. Now, a lot of this and the need to do it is played out against the long-term uncertainties of how things like sea level rise will actually be realised. There are predictions up here and there are predictions down here. What we can do at the moment is monitor those as effectively and closely as we can, just to see actually what happens. In the meantime, we always need to have one eye on it. This is on the Humber. This is a managed realignment, and it's quite a simple process. This is primary sea defence, as was, no longer considered to be sustainable, and where the intertidal habitats in front of it are being increasingly squeezed by rising tides. So, in this case, the seawall was set back, and intertidal habitat is now allowed to regenerate in front of it. So it's quite a simple procedure. It's now a well played out scenario that we're all still working with and experimenting with and seeing how effective and learning from it all the time. But it's now actually quite a common procedure. And this effectively creates space against that rising tide. It's creating space for habitats to adapt and change over time. Haysborough has already featured strongly. I'm going to use it again. Rob talked about the socio-economic issues of Haysborough, obviously important, and Natural England plays a part in the conversations about those. But the other issue of Haysborough is the continued erosion of those cliffs allows sediment to be freed up and protect coastlines elsewhere. And in this case, not too far south of here is the vulnerable frontage to the Norfolk Broads, which to some degree is dependent on the sediment being freed up from these cliffs. So issues of join-up and holistic thinking straight away. And this is Haysborough Cliffs SSI, Site of Special Scientific Interest. This is its boundary, but this is where the coastline we think currently is, and we saw that a lot on Rob's slides. Well, what this means is, one might argue now that the SSI features are now in the sea, and whilst for practical purposes it may not make too much difference to the way we work, it does actually present a legal challenge. So we get into a situation where not just with estuaries and dunes and beaches, but soft cliffs are effectively squeezed. They're squeezed between the rising tide and the land use on top of the cliff. And this one is stuck between that erosion and the agricultural land on top. So there's not a lot of room to manoeuvre here, unless of course we free up room for that coast to adapt and evolve. And one way of doing that is to future-proof site boundaries. I'm not going to labour on site boundaries too much because I already talked about how coasts don't really pay much due mind to those. But it is one way of actually trying to ensure that a coast has room to adapt. This cliff has room to erode, roll back with the rising tide, whilst protecting the reasons why it's designated. And it also potentially creates opportunities for access and enhancement of habitats on top of those cliffs. But to be able to do this, and Rob has touched on it, but I'm going to touch on it too, because Natural England has learned in the last few years, often from painful experience, that the only way to actually achieve this is to have the community on your side and to work with them from the outset. Humans versus wildlife is not a good place to be. The issue has to be one of humans versus wildlife. I think if we're into a situation where we're having to choose be in a confrontational place between one or the other, then we're failing. So trying to explain to people why the needs of, Sorry, completely gone. Can I go back to where I was? One minute. I was going to explain why the needs of the Bittern need to be properly communicated to people, because you can, money is available to protect the Bittern, but it isn't available, as Rob said, for people whose houses are falling off cliffs. Why should that be? If I lived on the cliff and my house was falling off, it might be pretty nice, to be honest. But notwithstanding that, the messages that we communicate, and this applies not just to me, but all of you, about why coasts change, needs to be communicated very effectively. So, just to summarise, a few headlines from what I've said. The only permanent thing about the coast is its change. Coastal habitats and species need to be given space to adapt and be more resilient. We're all onto a loser if we're trying to start fossilise features at the coast and fix them. We have to understand that in adapting to coastal change, habitats and species will sometimes be lost in situ, and that isn't necessarily a disaster. Protecting coastal landscapes won't stay the same, and we all need to plan and manage for that. And most importantly, we need to work with the communities and peoples affected. And just to finish, there's a fantastic example of Natural England's expertise in planning for coastal change on its own nature reserves. It's a bit of a cheat really, because this was after a storm event, but it serves the purpose perfectly well. Thanks for listening.